Sometimes you just don't know what to say to follow up a powerful message like that. So I'm just going to not try. Just let that speak. Wow. How many of you have ever found it fascinating, the Bible stories that they put into movie form? I'm sure you've probably seen. Raise your hand if you've been at least, at one point in your life, seen at least one movie that they've taken from, made into a movie. How many of you have ever seen a Bible story put into a movie form? Yeah. Probably my all-time favorite was The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. How many of you remember that? That was a long movie, by the way. I never realized as a kid growing up, but this is kind of a long movie. Of course, there's been tons of movies made about the Bible. And why is that? Why have movie producers decided to make a lot of movies? And we're not here to argue whether they are accurate or not. Brian, you'll just have to run this again this morning. We're not sure how accurate they are or not. Many of them aren't too accurate to the actual text of the Bible, but movie producers know that the Bible has some of the best material for drama on earth. I mean, really, it's powerful. The greatest drama and story in all the world is the true story of God reconciling this lost and broken world to Himself. What a story that is. And so, while that is true, I'm going to make this statement this morning. There are some stories in the Bible that should probably not be put into a movie form. Amen? Definitely Genesis 38 would fall into that category. There are some scripts in the Bible that might not be the best idea to put them on the big screen. Years ago, the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, came out with a rating system, right? G, PG, PG-13, and all the others. And I'm not sure where this one would be rated on the script, but I can just tell you this. As I prepared to preach this message this week, I was like, how am I going to talk about that? Because it's right there in Genesis 38. And if you've never read Genesis 38, I'm betting you'll read it today after this sermon. Because while everything is there in Genesis 38, there's some stuff that I'm still not sure if I'm comfortable talking about it today in mixed company. But the story that we're going to study today is one that has some serious issues that we're going to address. The life that we're going to study today in Genesis 38 makes people like Abraham and Jacob, those people we've studied in the last several weeks that aren't too good. They weren't the best behaved guys in all the world. The guy we're going to study today makes Abraham and Jacob look like Mother Teresa on steroids. I mean, this guy today is not your poster boy for somebody you would like to grow up and be like. And so the name of the guy that we're studying today here in Genesis 38 is a man by the name of Judah. Judah was known as a patriarch, meaning he was one of the founding tribes, one of the founding fathers of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. Judah was certainly a patriarch, but he was also one of the shadiest characters in the Bible. If Judah moved into your neighborhood, if he moved to the house next door to you, you would hide your kids, you would hide your wife, and you'd probably put your house on the market and move. Yeah, you probably would. We don't know a whole lot about Judah, but there is one chapter where Judah takes center stage, and that is Genesis 38. And Genesis 38 is one of the filthiest sections in all the Bible. And I am not here today to glorify that filth. But I am here today to preach upon it and to let you know this is one of the reasons that I know the Bible's inspired. Because the Bible does not shirk away from the reality of these men's lives. And for some reason, with me growing up, and maybe with you as well, for some reason it seems like these guys got a pass. They got a clean slate somehow over their life, and that they were these great guys to emulate. No, Judah was not a great guy to emulate your life after. And so I've kind of battled this week. I felt like maybe I need to get you to sign a waiver before I preach this sermon, getting permission. But I'm going to try to be as careful as I can, but also as specific as I can to preach this message, because God gave us the Bible with all of its grit and gunk. And so here is the uncut version of Genesis 38. Just to do a quick summary of the story of Judah, and we're just going to go through this rather quickly. And again, Brian, you'll just kind of have to follow. If I'm all over the place, I'm sorry, but our sound team does a great job. But anyway, the story begins with Judah. If you go back to Genesis 38, verse 1, and just kind of follow along here. We're not going to read all these verses for sake of time, but I'm going to just give you a quick summary of the plot line here of Genesis 38. The story begins with Judah lusting after a Canaanite woman. He proceeds to have an improper, intimate relationship with this woman. And in time, she ends up producing 3 sons. The first son's name was He was the oldest. The second son's name was Onan. He was the middle child. And then the final child's name was Shelah, and he was the youngest. And so you have these 3 sons born out of an illicit relationship that Judah has with a Canaanite woman. As we mentioned, was Judah's firstborn. He ended up marrying he was a half Canaanite son, and he ended up marrying a girl named Tamar, who was a Canaanite. This is not the same Tamar that we read about later on in the Bible, but same name. Evidently, did something stupid. He erred in his ways. No pun intended. And he lost his life. If you look at verse 7, it says, "And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him." He evidently did something very, very wicked. Of course, this is not out of the norm for God and how He would deal with people. We see what happened in Genesis chapter 6 with the whole world. And so something was going on behind the scenes in this cosmic war for the genealogical line of Christ, as we're going to see today. And so did something very wicked. He lost his life. Then the second-born son, Onan, the middle son, was told by his father Judah to go in unto his brother's wife, and that's as clear as it needs to be, and raise up a generation of children in the place of his brother who died. Onan disobeys this directive. If you look at verses 9 and 10, and I'm not going to read them, but verses 9 and 10, they're on the screen. You can read them. Onan is told to do this. He doesn't do it. And he dies also. So 2 out of 3 sons so far have died. I'm not sure if Tamar's the problem or if they're the problem, but they've both died. And so far in this story, and we're just kind of cutting through the verses here quickly, but so far in this story, you have a story of lust, illicit sex, 2 dead sons, and an ancient lesson in birth control. How many of you would like for me just to stop the story right here and there and just call it a day and go eat at Cracker Barrel? Anybody? Yeah. I'm already not comfortable talking about this. How many of you would agree this story should probably not be put on the big screen? Yeah, we would both agree with that. So Judah is left with his widowed Canaanite daughter-in-law, Tamar, and he tells her to wait until his youngest son, Shelah, grows up so that she can marry him. The time comes when, evidently, as you read these next preceding verses, as you read this, evidently the time came when Shelah should have been given to Tamar, and this did not occur. So Tamar takes matters into her own hands. She actually decides to part ways with Judah and go back to her father's house in a different city. And she decides to take matters into her own hands. She heard somehow that Judah was going to be coming through her city, and so she removes her widow's garments and puts on the attire of a harlot. This is not going well. This is getting worse. Again, you can see the verses there, verses 13 through 15. "And it was told Tamar, saying, Behold, thy father-in-law goeth up to Timnath to shear his sheep. And she put her widow's garments off from her and covered her with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in an open place," kind of on the street, so to speak, which is by the way to Timnath, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given unto him to wife. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a harlot, because she had covered her face. So Judah sees her, and he doesn't recognize that this is his daughter-in-law. but assumes that she is just a common harlot of the city. Verse 16. And you can read that. I will not, but you can read that verse. And so to just, make a long story short here, Judah pays her for some services. And technically he doesn't even pay her because he has to give her credit. And so he gives her a promissory note, his staff, his bracelet, and his signet ring, I believe. I get the details mixed up there, but you can read them there. Verse 18, he has to pay her on credit for services rendered. 3 months pass, and word comes to Judah that his daughter-in-law is expecting a child and has played the part of a harlot. So Judah commands that she should be brought before them and that she should be burnt. This story got me to thinking about John chapter 8. You remember that story in John chapter 8? The woman who was caught in adultery? My big question is, where was the man in that story in John chapter 8? And the question here in Genesis 38 is, they're about to burn her. I wonder if anything might be rolling on in Judah's mind as he's rehearsing the last 3 months of his life. But they bring her before them, and they're going to burn her for her wickedness. Only problem is, she reveals the tokens that he had left with her on credit when services were rendered. And all is made plain then. And if you read down there, verse 25, when she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whose these are, I am with child. And she said, discern, I pray thee, whose are these? The signet and bracelets and staff. Verse 26, and Judah acknowledged them and said, she hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah my son, and he knew her again no more. Well, that's wise. Verse 27, and it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. So Tamar has 2 sons here, Pharez and Zerah. What is by the way, again, we shouldn't put that story on the big screen, right? Right? Everybody be in agreement? Good, okay, just want to make sure. What's the point of this story? Why did God put this story in the Bible? I want you to notice where Genesis 38 occurs. Now, the next slide is very profound. Are you ready? 37, 38, 39. I know that's a profound slide, but notice where Genesis 38 occurs. It's right after Genesis 37 and right before Genesis 39. And you're like, yes, Captain Obvious. 38 comes after 37, and it comes before 39. I know. But the placement, I'm going to try to withhold my... the placement of this story is huge, big, mind-blowing. What story had God just started to tell in Genesis 37? The story of Joseph, yes. And next week, I can't wait for next week. You've got to be here for next week, because next week ends our Genesis series, and it ends with fireworks. But let me tell you this, here's some fireworks today, because you see something amazing here in the story about why God would place such a seedy story that is full of moral train wreck right here in Genesis 38, as if God stopped mid-sentence as he was starting to tell us about one of the most moral guys in all the Bible. Just look at this for a second. If you look back at Genesis 37, you see the account of Joseph and his brethren and how they sold him into Egypt, and he became the servant in Potiphar's house. It ends right there in Genesis 37, verse 36. And then there's this chapter where Joseph's name isn't even mentioned. Not one time. But another guy by the name of Judah is. And then, as if nothing happened in the story, it just kept on going, right at the end of Genesis 38, verse 30, guess what picks up in chapter 39, verse 1? the story of Joseph again. My friends, that is massively huge, and that's what I want to talk to you about today as we look at the end, or the rest of this story. What was Joseph known for in the Bible? As I just mentioned, he was known for his upstanding morality and his unswerving obedience to God. If there is anybody that we should model our lives after morally, it would be Joseph. And there are some great applicational truths there for how look at verse 9 of Genesis 39. He said, "There is none greater in this house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So you've got this moral, impeccable character in Joseph, but then God sticks this guy named Judah, who's one of the worst examples of morality, right in Genesis 38, right in the middle of the beginning of the story of Joseph. The story of Judah and Tamar literally interrupt the Joseph story. And I would argue with you or present to you that that's an intentional interruption. Nothing God does in the Bible is without specificity and purpose. I didn't drink enough coffee this morning. Nothing that God does in the Bible is without specificity and purpose. So it's an intentional interruption. But the big question is, why? Why? And hold on that screen, Brian. Thank you. Why? Moses deliberately inserted the story of Judah's debauchery into Joseph's story in order to contrast the two characters. Joseph fled sexual lust. Judah seemed to sprint towards it. Joseph is morally impeccable. Judah is a moral train wreck. But why the contrast? Now see, right here, we would all assume that the contrast is a moral contrast. Oh, okay, yeah. And if you read the Bible as a self-help book to become the better version of your old dead you, that's what you're going to see. And I'm not saying that that's not an application. I'm not saying that we should not try to model our lives after Joseph rather than Judah. Amen. That's exactly right. You don't want that kind of baggage in your life. You do not want that kind of heartache in your life. You do not want that kind of guilt in your life. Listen, sin is never a good idea. Sin always brings death, always brings destruction, always brings guilt, always brings pain and suffering. But why the contrast? And my friends, we must see what God is doing here. Because if you conclude that the contrast between Joseph and Judah is a contrast on how to live a moral life like Joseph and how not to live an immoral life like Judah, then you have missed the scarlet thread. You remember what we read this morning? The scarlet thread. Why would God go to such pains to say the color of the thread? Oh, hold on. We'll get there. But certainly we see this truth come out. Genesis 38:28, where this scarlet thread is mentioned. And so I would present to you that the reason for the contrast is not primarily a moralistic contrast, but a messianic contrast. A messianic contrast. What do I mean? What God was about to show His people is that regardless of the mess of your life, regardless of the train wreck that you have made your life, God is in the business of redeeming. God is in the business of reconciling. God can take God's rock-solid promise to redeem His wayward children and to be in relationship with His people cannot be thwarted by human wickedness. And you might say, I don't get it, Pastor. That's why I'm here. I'm going to try to help you see this picture. Because I'm telling you, friends, this blew my mind. God will relate to His children. God will bring His creation back into Eden. God has purpose to love humanity, to forgive them. He desires to enjoy fellowship with them forever, and He has extended to them the greatest sign of love in all the world, the gift of His Son. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. And so Jesus Christ came through the line of David, through the line of Abraham. And guess who was a part of that line? Not Joseph. Judah! Everything in our transactional bones would say God should choose Joseph to carry on the genealogy down through to the line of Christ. Not Judah. But who does the Bible refer to? What is one of the titles of Jesus Christ, the Messiah? He is called, as we just heard about in Revelation 5, the Lion of the tribe of Judah? God will do what He is going to do by His grace and nothing else. Go ahead to that next screen, Brian. The only way that God establishes relationship with us, and ever will, is by His grace. I don't know how anyone can read the story of Judah and come away with any other conclusion than to say, it's all by grace. If that can be redeemed, if God can use Judah to be a part of the line of Christ, then my friends, I don't care what you've done, where you've been, who you are. I'm here today to tell you that God can transform your life. He can take your mess and He can turn it into a masterpiece. Oh, I'm sure Judah would look back on his life later and say, that was stupid, that was wrong, that was wicked. And I'm sure he dealt with scars the rest of his life because of that. And we are not saying that, oh, just go out and see how big of a mess you can make with your life, and then let's really test God and see if He can make it to be a masterpiece. No, because you don't know about the deceitfulness of sin in your life, friend, and you don't know how that'll harden you, and you don't know what kind of pain that'll cause you and how that'll impact people that you care about the most. But I am here today to tell you that God's grace was not intimidated by a story as filthy as that. God's promised Messiah, the one who would crush the snake and send freedom to the world. Genesis 3:15, I remind you. Genesis 3:15 says, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. So there was a promise, a genealogical promise made, that down through the ages there would be one born of the seed of the woman who would be able to deliver the people. And so this promise of the Messiah would not go through Joseph. It would go through Judah. Even though everything in our transactional bones would want us to see God use Joseph, because Joseph was certainly the morally superior choice to Judah. If anyone qualified to be in the genealogical line of Christ because of behavior, it was Joseph. But God deliberately chose the genealogical line of Judah and not Joseph to bring the Savior into the world. God deliberately led Moses to insert this story after the story with Joseph had begun. A story that we would never take from the Bible and make into a movie. A story that is full of such moral mess that it turns our stomach. I feel weird even talking about what happened in Genesis 38. But you know what that story does? It takes all the focus off Joseph and Judah, and it puts it all on the scarlet thread, Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And my friends, if you're walking around here today thinking that you've made something of your life, you're in a bigger mess than anybody. Because you're not self-made. You don't make anything. No, God takes the broken and He makes something new. God is the master of miracles. And I can't think of a greater miracle in the Old Testament than this story, a story that God somehow turns and uses for good. What's so fascinating at the end of this story is that little section about the birth of these two twins. The birth of two illegitimate children, born, sired by their father-in-law. And notice that Zerah put forth his hand first, and the midwife tied a scarlet thread around it. But then that baby's hand went back in the birth canal, and out came a different hand, his younger brother, Phares. And Phares technically ended up being birthed first. Interesting. So God took Judah, and then He selected Phares, the illegitimate son of an illicit affair between a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law who was dressed up as a harlot, to be a part of His plan to redeem the world. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. You'll be reading this probably here in a month as we prepare for Christmas and as we celebrate the incarnation of Jesus. One of my favorite stories at Christmas time, oddly enough, is the book of Ruth. And we're going to look at Ruth here again today as well. But Matthew chapter number 1. Matthew chapter number 1 is when the gospel writer Matthew was giving the genealogical credentials for why Jesus Christ was the Messiah. And if you look back at verse 1 of Matthew chapter 1, I'll turn there quickly as well just to read this. This verse isn't on the screen. But Matthew 1 verse 1, it says, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So, let's just make sure we got this straight. So Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judah, or Judas. It's a different spelling, same guy, Judah. The one we just read about in Genesis 38, Judah is in the line of Jesus Christ. Now, but notice it says not only the son of Abraham, but Christ the son of David. Both of those characters were very important to the Jewish people to know that this has been established, that the Messiah would come through Abraham. Why? Because of the Abrahamic covenant given to Abraham in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15. And then, of course, the promises given to David in the Davidic covenant, which, oddly enough, was just mainly a restatement of the unconditional Abrahamic covenant. And so what Matthew is doing is he's tracing the genealogy, and he says, right here, Judah. Hey, Jew, who's reading this, you remember Judah? Yeah, that guy in Genesis 38 who was a moral train wreck, who was a mess. Yeah, that one. And then he mentions both children that Judah sired from Tamar, who's also mentioned here, Phares and Zerah. And then he says, and the line continued down through Phares. Now, if that was all we had in the Bible, that'd be good. Yeah, wow, Pastor, God took Judah and used him in the genealogical line instead of Joseph. And wow, that means God can still use me even though I might have failed God. Yeah, that's all great. But Ruth chapter 4, verse 12. When Ruth got married to Boaz, which really was not unlike the story in Genesis 38. What had happened to Ruth's husband? Her husband had died. And so what Judah was trying to do is he was trying to raise up a kinsman redeemer who would continue the generations. Because I believe that these people understood that promise from Genesis 3:15. And they understood that in order for the promise of Genesis 3:15 to come to fruition, they had to follow God's directive to be fruitful and multiply. And so there was this kinsman redeemer that Judah tried to raise up, but Onan wouldn't do it. And then evidently Judah lost faith somewhere because he didn't give Shelah to Tamar when the timing was right. And so basically Tamar took things in her own hands and got her father-in-law to have an illicit relationship with her. And I'm not trying to go back and talk about those details again, but picture this. So they didn't fulfill the kinsman redeemer role, but Ruth did. Boaz did. Boaz was a great picture. He is a great picture of Jesus Christ and the beautiful kinsman redeemer, which also is tied to Revelation 5. I'm just amazed, brother. I was sitting there with glory bumps just thinking, whoa! Because you have got to see this verse. So this person at the wedding feast, we just had a wedding here on Friday night. It was beautiful, wasn't it? Wow. But can you imagine somebody standing up at the reception saying, people, ding, 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 people, I want to make a toast. Jana and Anthony, let thy house be like the house of Pharez, whom Tamar bare unto Judah, of the seed which the Lord shall give thee of this young woman. I mean, literally, that would be like me standing up at Anthony and Jana's wedding and saying, Anthony and Jana, I hope God gives you a fruitful, godly relationship like he has Bill and Hillary. Oh, I'm sorry, I just got political. But can you imagine that? I mean, that was the seedy nature of Genesis 38. For somebody to stand up at Ruth's wedding and say, this was like, it was a prophecy. Deuteronomy 23 verse 2 talks about how an illegitimate son was left out of the blessings until the 10th generation. And if you keep on reading Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 and following, you will find out that Ruth, the 10th generation from there, from Pharez, was none other than King David. King David. But it gets better. I'm like, as I'm studying this week, I'm just like, oh, wow. But as I got to thinking, I thought, okay, I've studied something in the past about Genesis 38 that was rather interesting. Now, what I'm about to say, I don't want you to think that I'm crazy. And I know that there's been some crazy people who have taken this area of science and research, and they've used it to try to predict the future and get way overboard into numerology and into Bible codes. How many of you have ever heard about the Bible codes? I'm not saying that it's all illegitimate. I think some of it is, and what I'm about to present to you, I present with 100% confidence that Moses didn't put it there on purpose. God did. So we just said that Ruth, the 10th generation from Ruth, was David. And if you read those generations there, in fact, we have to do this. We have to do this. Go back to Ruth. Let's see that. We're almost done. Go back to Ruth. Go back to Ruth. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Ruth chapter 4 and verse 18. Now these are the generations of Pharez. Again, who was Pharez? The illegitimate son of Judah and Tamar. Pharez begat Hezron, and Hezron begat Ram, and Ram begat Amminadab, and Amminadab begat Nahshon, and Nahshon begat Salmon, and Salmon begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. All right? I'm going to put up another screen. Look at this screen. You might not be able to tell what this is, but this is the original Hebrew Bible. And in Genesis 38, we're talking hundreds of years before this happened. Ruth, in Genesis 38, every 49 letters in chronological order you have the genealogy of Ruth. Boaz, Ruth, Obed, Jesse, David. Right there in Genesis 38, in chronological order, before Ruth would ever meet Boaz, before all this would ever happen, before the house of Pharez, let thy house be as the house of Pharez. What was that? It was a prophecy to say that through Judah, through Pharez, through Boaz, through this genealogy, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, the bright and morning star, the King of grace, who is not intimidated. Listen, Satan was the one at work in Genesis 38. Let's be clear. You know what Satan was trying to do? He was trying to thwart. He was trying to taint the genealogical line. He was trying to ruin this. God just had to sit back and say, nice try. God's grace is immeasurable. It's inexhaustible. It is unconquerable. It is overwhelming. And so if we cannot receive the obvious contrast in this story, it's because we willingly choose to remain in our self-righteousness and think that we can be morally superior. My friends, we can't. We fail every day. And that's why it has to be all of grace, always by grace. Listen, we bring nothing to the table. When we come to Christ, we bring nothing to the table of our own. It's not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to His mercy, He saved us. And so our performance does not dictate God's love before we're saved. And our performance doesn't dictate God's love to us after we've come to Christ. And when we really start to believe that and receive it, it's amazing how our wants start to change. I heard yesterday about a newborn baby and a mama, and how she said it's amazing how when you love somebody this much, you just want to serve. I'm like, yes, that's it. Keep yourselves in the love of God and watch your life change. Over and over in this series that we have studied together, God's grace has been poured out upon people who did not deserve it. People whose lives were wrecked by sin. Judah, did Judah deserve to even be in the same ballpark with the Messiah? No, and neither do you or I. Welcome, my friends, to a gospel that is bigger than you and that cannot be tamed down by you. I'm thankful for that kind of grace. I'm thankful for that kind of love. With every head bowed and every eye closed this morning.